He locked the vault at midnight and never came out breathing. Welcome to Marple Casebook. I'm your host, Selwyn. Let's uncover this mystery together. Comment below with where you're watching from. Your presence brings life to every case. Let's begin. The village of St. Mary Mead had seen its fair share of peculiar happenings, but nothing quite like the death of Mr. Archibald Pritchard, the esteemed yet notoriously aloof manager of the local bank. The circumstances were as unsettling as they were inexplicable. It was a crisp autumn morning when young Ronald Nash, a junior clerk at the bank, arrived promptly at 8 to begin his day's work. He was the first to enter the building, as he always was, unlocking the heavy oak doors with a brass key issued only to the most trusted employees. Everything inside was precisely as it had been left the previous evening. Ledgers stacked neatly, quills still resting in inkpots, the faint scent of parchment and sealing wax lingering in the air. But when he entered Mr. Pritchard's private office, he stopped short. The banker sat at his desk, his head tilted slightly to one side, eyes staring lifelessly ahead. There was no sign of struggle, no disturbance to the paperwork before him. The bank's great iron vault remained firmly locked, its mechanisms untouched. A steaming cup of tea sat beside him, untouched save for a single sip. But most curious of all was the single playing card resting atop the stack of documents before him, the ace of spades. Ronald recoiled, dropping his case with a thud that echoed unnervingly in the stillness. His instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong, and without another moment's hesitation, he sprinted out the door and directly to the constabulary. Inspector Craddock arrived swiftly, his boots clacking against the polished floor as he took in the scene. A doctor was summoned, and within minutes it was determined that Mr. Pritchard was indeed dead, though from what, nobody could immediately say. There were no visible wounds, no signs of poison, and no evidence of foul play beyond the eerie placement of the playing card. The inspector frowned, rubbing his chin as he surveyed the office. Locked doors. No signs of forced entry, no weapon, no struggle. He exhaled heavily. This doesn't make any sense. It was only natural that the news traveled fast. By midday, the entire village hummed with speculation. Some whispered of a curse, others of a masterful, untraceable poison. A few entertained the notion of ghosts, recalling the bank's peculiar history, once a debtor's prison, its foundations steeped in misery. Among those intrigued was Miss Jane Marple. She had been enjoying her morning tea when the gossip reached her ears. Death was not unfamiliar to her, nor was the intricate web of deception that often accompanied it. With a keen sense for the peculiar and a mind sharper than most, she felt an immediate stirring of curiosity. By the time she arrived at the bank, the inspector had exhausted all immediate avenues of inquiry. Miss Marple, he greeted with a wary nod. He knew better than to dismiss her insights outright. Strange business, this. No witnesses, no apparent cause of death in that blasted card. It's as if the man simply stopped. Miss Marple adjusted the lace cuffs of her gloves as she peered around the office. Her blue eyes, sharp despite their softness, took in every detail. An ace of spades, you say? She stepped forward, examining the card with interest but careful not to touch it. How very theatrical. Theatrical or not, it's the only thing out of place, Craddock admitted. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, examining Mr. Pritchard's face. He appeared frozen in an expression of faint surprise, as though death had come upon him too swiftly for fear or pain. Then her gaze flickered to the untouched tea. No poison, you said. No trace of it in the cup, the inspector confirmed. She hummed thoughtfully and turned her attention to the room's layout. The single window was bolted from the inside, ruling out an intruder. There were no secret compartments, no disturbances in the fine layer of dust that clung to the shelves beyond normal handling. And his schedule? When was the last time anyone saw him alive? His assistant, a Miss Everly, left at 6 in the evening. Said he intended to stay late to finish some figures. The night watchman checked the building at 9. All seemed well. Then the lad found him this morning. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. The locked door suggests he was alone when he died. But that card, it is not the sort of thing one leaves behind by accident. Which means what? Craddock asked. That it was placed there deliberately, after the fact. She straightened, glancing once more at the lifeless banker. This was not a natural death, Inspector. No matter how quiet or undisturbed the scene appears, someone ensured that Mr. Pritchard would deposit his very last breath. Miss Marple let her gaze linger on the scene, her mind weaving through the details like a deft hand sorting fine embroidery thread. Inspector Craddock, ever methodical, was already questioning Ronald Nash again, but the young clerk had little more to offer beyond his initial shock. "Had anything been troubling Mr. Pritchard recently?" she asked gently, stepping closer. "Perhaps an unusual visitor, a disagreement at the bank?" Ronald hesitated, his eyes darting toward the inspector as if seeking permission to speak. "Well," he said slowly, "Mr. Pritchard was a private sort of man, but now that you mention it, last week he did receive a rather odd letter. I didn't read it, of course, but he looked pale when he finished. Muttered something about old debts coming due. He tore it up straight away and burned the pieces in the fireplace." Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. "Old debts, you say? How very interesting." Inspector Craddock sighed. "If he destroyed the letter, there's little we can do. Did he discuss it with anyone?" "Not that I know of, sir," Ronald replied. Though Miss Everleigh might have noticed something. She was his assistant for years, knew his moods better than anyone. Craddock nodded. "We'll have a word with her." Miss Marple, however, turned her attention back to the desk. "Mr. Nash," she said kindly, "do you recall if this desk was locked when you arrived this morning?" Ronald shook his head. "No, ma'am, it was just as it is now." She peered down at the drawers, carefully noting how the middle one had not been pushed in all the way. With a gloved hand, she eased it open, revealing an orderly array of ledgers, ink bottles, and a small black velvet pouch. It was drawn tightly shut, the drawstring tied in an unfamiliar knot. "That," Craddock murmured, frowning, "doesn't seem like something our meticulous Mr. Pritchard would have left out of place." Miss Marple pulled the pouch free and, after a moment's hesitation, untied the knot. Inside, nestled within the soft fabric, was a single gold cufflink. It was finely crafted, bearing an engraved crest in the shape of a serpent entwined around a key. The inspector exhaled sharply. "Well, well, that's something, isn't it?" Miss Marple examined the cufflink carefully. "Indeed it is," she murmured. "A very distinct design. Have you seen anything like it before?" Craddock shook his head. "Not in St. Mary Mead, but it might belong to a visitor, perhaps someone Mr. Pritchard met last night." He turned to the constable at his side. "Take this to the station. We'll see if any of the local jewelers recognize the design." Miss Marple, however, was still studying the desk. Something about the scene felt deliberately arranged, as though whoever had left the playing card had taken care to ensure the rest of the room appeared undisturbed. She turned to Ronald once more. "Tell me, dear, when you arrived this morning, was anything at all different from how Mr. Pritchard usually left his office?" Ronald thought for a moment, then frowned. "Actually, yes. His chair." "What about it?" Craddock asked. "It's always tucked in when he leaves for the night. He was a stickler about that. But this morning it was pulled out. Just a little, like someone had stood up in a hurry." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "he wasn't alone after all." Craddock cursed under his breath. If someone else was here, then how the devil did they leave? Every door was locked, and the watchman saw no one. Miss Marple turned her attention to the single window. Though bolted now, she leaned in and studied the latch, running a gloved finger along the edge. There was a faint smudge on the metal, as though it had been handled and then carefully repositioned. She turned back to Craddock. "I believe, Inspector, that our mysterious visitor may not have used the door at all." Craddock stepped forward, following her gaze. "You think they left through the window?" "Or arrived that way," she said simply. Ronald swallowed hard. But this is the second floor?" Miss Marple offered a small, knowing smile. "Yes, dear. Which means whoever did this was either very daring or very determined." Craddock exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "We'll need to check for any marks outside. A ladder, perhaps, or something they could have used to climb." "Indeed." Miss Marple straightened, casting a final glance around the office before adding, "And I think it's time we spoke with Miss Everly. If anyone knew what truly troubled Mr. Pritchard, it would be her." With that, the investigation took its next step. But in Miss Marple's mind, the pieces of the puzzle were only just beginning to align. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock did not have to go far to find Miss Everly. She was waiting just beyond the bank's entrance, standing stiffly in her trim navy blue coat, gloved hands clasped tightly around her handbag. A woman of careful habits and even temperament, Miss Everly had worked as Mr. Pritchard's secretary for nearly 15 years. Her expression was composed, but the tightness around her mouth suggested distress carefully controlled. "I understand you are the last to see Mr. Pritchard alive," Inspector Craddock began as they stepped aside for a measure of privacy. "Can you tell us about yesterday evening?" Miss Everly nodded once. "There was nothing unusual. Mr. Pritchard was reviewing the quarterly accounts, as he often did at the end of the day. I finished my tasks and asked if he needed anything before I left. He said no." "And he seemed quite himself?" Miss Marple inquired gently. The secretary hesitated just a fraction too long before answering. "He was always a serious man, but yes, I would say so. Perhaps a little preoccupied." "Preoccupied?" Craddock pressed. Miss Everly lowered her gaze. "It wasn't my place to ask, but he had been unsettled for the past week. Distracted. I assumed it was some financial matter." "Or something else?" Miss Marple prompted, watching closely. Miss Everly's fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. "If there was more to it, he did not confide in me." The words were neatly spoken, but Miss Marple was not entirely convinced. There was something in the woman's restraint, a wariness that suggested she knew more than she was willing to share. "And did he receive any visitors last night?" "No." "Are you certain?" Another pause, almost imperceptible. "Then I left at 6 o'clock. If someone arrived afterward, I wouldn't know." Inspector Craddock studied her for a moment before nodding. "Very well, Miss Everly. If you remember anything else, do let us know." She inclined her head, then walked briskly away, her shoes clicking against the pavement. As Miss Marple watched her disappear down the road, she murmured, "She is a woman of discretion, but not necessarily of candor." Craddock sighed. "I noticed, and I'd wager that preoccupation she mentioned was linked to that letter Nash spoke of." He straightened. "Let's see if anyone else had business with Mr. Pritchard yesterday." Their next stop was the butcher's shop, where George Pettigrew, the night watchman, had been seen purchasing his usual morning ration of bacon. He was a burly man with a thick mustache, his face ruddy from years spent in the cold. When questioned, he scratched his head and frowned. "Did my rounds as usual. 9 o'clock. Checked the doors. All locked. Lights were off, except the office. Figured Mr. Pritchard was still at his books, so I didn't disturb him." "And you saw nothing unusual?" Craddock asked. Pettigrew shook his head. "Not a thing." Then, as if remembering something, he added, "Well, there was a gentleman standing across the street when I passed by, smoking a cigarette. Didn't think much of it. Folk waiting for omnibuses all the time." "What did he look like?" "Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low. Can't say more than that, I'm afraid." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock. A mysterious observer? Someone waiting for Mr. Pritchard to leave? Or someone ensuring he never would? They thanked Pettigrew and moved on, their next visit taking them to the vicarage, where Lawrence Denning, a long-time client of the bank, had left word that he wished to speak with the authorities. A thin, fidgety man in his 40s, Denning greeted them at the door, his nervous energy apparent. "Terrible business," he said at once, ushering them inside. "Dreadful. You see, I had an appointment with Mr. Pritchard yesterday evening. Quite routine, mind you, just a discussion regarding my accounts. But when I arrived at the bank shortly after 7, the place was already locked up tight. I knocked, of course, but there was no answer." Craddock narrowed his eyes. "You had an appointment?" "Well, not in writing," Denning admitted, adjusting his spectacles. "But he told me just that morning that I should stop by if I wished to go over my figures. I thought it odd that he wasn't there. Did you see anyone else near the bank?" Denning hesitated, then shook his head. "No, no one." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "And when you left, Mr. Denning, did you go straight home?" Denning's fingers twitched. Well, not directly. I stopped by the post office to settle a bill, and then I walked home. But truly, I had no idea anything was amiss." There was something about the way he spoke, eager to share but overly careful in his phrasing. "Did you know Mr. Pritchard well?" Miss Marple asked. Denning's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "As well as anyone could. He was a fine banker, but not a particularly warm man." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "you were quite concerned when he did not answer his door." Denning's eyes darted to hers. "Naturally, I was surprised. Nothing more." A little too eager, Miss Marple thought, and a little too rehearsed. As they left the vicarage, Inspector Craddock muttered, "He's hiding something." "Oh, quite," Miss Marple agreed. "And so is Miss Everleigh, and perhaps even our night watchman, though I suspect his omission was unintentional." Craddock exhaled. Different stories, small contradictions, but the truth is in there somewhere. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. And I believe we shall find it soon enough." Miss Marple walked in measured steps beside Inspector Craddock, her mind weaving through the tangled strands of deception that each witness and suspect had laid before them. It was always the way of such matters. No one told the entire truth, but neither did they often lie outright. The key was in the omissions, the hesitations, the carefully curated half-truths that revealed more than they concealed. "So far," Craddock muttered, "we have a secretary who keeps her own counsel, a night watchman with a vague recollection of a stranger in the dark, and a banker's client who was either genuinely concerned or covering his tracks. And then there's the cufflink." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts returning to the small black pouch and the finely engraved gold. Such an object was not easily misplaced. It was a personal belonging, and if it had been left in Mr. Pritchard's desk, then either it was planted, or its owner had been there when they ought not to have been. They arrived at the bank once more, where Ronald Nash was still at his desk, pale but composed. He stood as they entered, looking to Craddock expectantly. "Tell me, Mr. Nash," Miss Marple asked gently, "did Mr. Pritchard ever mention a Mr. Denning to you?" Ronald frowned in thought. "Denning? The name sounds familiar. Oh, yes, he has an account here. Modest funds, nothing remarkable. But there was a bit of a stir some time ago. A business investment of his went sour, and he nearly defaulted on a loan from the bank." Craddock's interest sharpened. "And Pritchard handled it?" Ronald nodded. "Yes, he was very firm about repayments. I remember Mr. Denning coming in rather agitated one day, practically begging for an extension. I wasn't privy to the details, but I do know Mr. Pritchard was unmoved by sentiment." Miss Marple's hands folded neatly before her. "And this was when? Perhaps 6 months ago?" Miss Marple exchanged a look with Craddock. A poor investment, a denied extension, a desperate man. It was a reason, certainly. But was it enough for murder? They thanked Nash and left the bank, deciding their next step was to visit the local jeweler. Enfin, the cufflink bore a crest. It might be traceable. At Porter's Fine Jewelers, they were greeted by Mr. Porter himself, an elderly gentleman with sharp eyes behind silver-rimmed spectacles. When presented with the cufflink, he studied it with professional interest before nodding. "This is a custom design," he said. "Very fine work and unmistakable." Craddock leaned forward. "You recognize it?" "Indeed, it belongs to the Mortimer family." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Mortimer?" "Yes. Charles Mortimer had a set made years ago. He came from old money, but the family fortune dwindled over the years. His son, Gerald, inherited the remnants." Craddock frowned. "Gerald Mortimer, does he still live in the village?" "He does, though I dare say not as comfortably as his father once did." As they stepped back onto the cobbled street, Craddock exhaled sharply. "So now we have another piece of the puzzle. A wealthy family fallen on hard times, and one of their prized possessions turns up in Pritchard's desk." Miss Marple's gaze remained thoughtful. "Yes, my dear Inspector. And the question is, was it left there as a message, or did Mr. Pritchard take it for a reason?" They wasted no time making their way to Gerald Mortimer's home, a once stately house that now bore the signs of faded grandeur. The door was answered by a man in his mid-40s, lean and sharp-featured, his eyes wary as he took them in. "Yes." Craddock wasted no time. "Mr. Mortimer, we're investigating the murder of Mr. Pritchard. We found something of yours in his office." The man stiffened. "Something of mine?" Wordlessly, Craddock held up the cufflink. Mortimer's reaction was swift, a flicker of recognition, quickly masked. "That isn't mine," he said flatly. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, but the jeweler was quite certain. It's a Mortimer family piece." His jaw tightened. "Then it must have been stolen." "Or left behind," Craddock said coolly. Mortimer exhaled, his fingers pressing against the doorframe. "I had no reason to harm Pritchard." "But you did know him," Miss Marple observed. Mortimer hesitated. "I had dealings with him, yes. My father's financial troubles extended to me. I sought a loan. He refused." "When was this?" "Several months ago." Craddock's tone was firm. "And last night? Where were you?" Mortimer's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "At home, alone. No one can vouch for you." His lips pressed into a thin line. "No." As they left, Craddock sighed. Another motive, another weak alibi. Miss Marple walked in quiet thought, her mind fitting together the puzzle. Denning, Mortimer, Everleigh, all had connections to Pritchard. All had reasons to wish him ill, but none explained everything. The cufflink, the letter, the playing card. It was still a web of uncertainty. And yet, in the tangle of deception, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. Inspector Craddock was not a man prone to hasty conclusions, but as he and Miss Marple retraced their steps to the station, there was a flicker of certainty in his manner. The pieces, jumbled as they were, had started to form a shape, one that pointed in a single, damning direction. "We have motive," he said as they entered his office, removing his hat and tossing it onto the desk. Denning was desperate, Mortimer was bitter, and Miss Everleigh, well, there's something she's not telling us. But the cufflink, Miss Marple, that's tangible, that puts Mortimer at the scene. Miss Marple, ever composed, settled into the chair opposite him and folded her hands. "It certainly places the cufflink at the scene, my dear Inspector, but does it place Mr. Mortimer there?" Craddock exhaled. "Come now, you saw his face when we showed it to him. He knew it was his, and he has no alibi." Miss Marple smiled gently. "No, indeed, but I do wonder if Mr. Mortimer is quite the sort of man to leave behind such a personal token, should he have truly committed the crime. It is terribly convenient." Before Craddock could reply, the door swung open and a constable entered, looking somewhat breathless. "Sir, there's been a development." Craddock straightened. "Go on." We've just received a report from a pawnbroker in Market Basing. This morning a man came in and attempted to sell the second cufflink of the set. Craddock shot Miss Marple a sharp glance before turning back to the constable. And did the pawnbroker get a name? No, sir, but he described the man as well-dressed. Nervous. Well-dressed, Craddock repeated, his brows drawing together. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. Now, that is interesting. Mr. Mortimer, you will recall, was not particularly well-dressed, a gentleman in decline, one might say. Craddock frowned. Then who the devil— A thought struck him, and he reached for the case file, flipping hastily through pages until he found what he was looking for. Denning, he murmured. Denning came into money some years ago, but lost most of it in poor investments. He had enough to dress well, but not enough to afford another failure. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. And if Mr. Denning were in dire need of funds, what better way to secure them than by taking advantage of an old family trinket? The constable shifted uncomfortably. Shall we bring him in, sir? Craddock hesitated only a moment before nodding. Yes. Pick him up for questioning. By late afternoon, Lawrence Denning sat in the interrogation room, his fingers tapping restlessly on the table. He had insisted upon his innocence, though his explanations had been flimsy at best. When confronted with the pawnbroker's account, his composure faltered, his insistence turning to indignant protests. I found that cufflink, he declared. It was on the pavement outside the bank. I saw its value and took it. Craddock leaned forward. And you didn't think to mention this before? Denning's mouth opened and closed, his breath coming short. I didn't see the harm. It was just lying there. Craddock exhaled slowly. Denning, you claim to have knocked on Pritchard's door and received no answer. You said you saw no one else there, but now you admit you found an expensive cufflink outside the bank. That suggests someone was there. Denning's fingers tightened into fists. I don't know what you're suggesting, Inspector. Miss Marple, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke, her voice as gentle as ever. Mr. Denning, I wonder, was it truly on the pavement, or was it given to you? Denning flinched. Craddock seized upon it. Who gave it to you, Denning? Denning shook his head rapidly. No one. I swear it. Miss Marple sighed. I do think, Inspector, that this is not quite the solution we hoped it might be. Craddock leaned back, his expression darkening. Denning was involved, of that there was little doubt. But the manner of his involvement was less clear. The confession was too weak, too forced. He was lying, but not necessarily about the crime itself. At that moment, another constable entered, his expression hesitant. Sir, we've just received word. The autopsy report came in. Craddock stiffened. And? The constable swallowed. Time of death was earlier than we estimated, around 6:30. Craddock shot Miss Marple a look of disbelief. But that means— Miss Marple nodded slowly. That Mr. Denning was telling the truth after all. When he knocked on the door at 7, Mr. Pritchard was already dead. Craddock stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room. Which means the murderer wasn't lurking in the dark at 9 o'clock. The real killer had already done their work and was long gone. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, my dear Inspector. It seems our case is not quite as closed as we thought. Denning, still seated, exhaled a long, shuddering breath. You see? I told you. I didn't kill him. Craddock frowned. No, perhaps you didn't. But you're still hiding something. Denning said nothing. Miss Marple watched him carefully, then turned back to Craddock. If we were mistaken about the timeline, we must reconsider all of our assumptions. We have been looking for someone sneaking in after hours. But what if the murderer was someone who left the bank at 6 and never returned? Craddock's expression darkened. Miss Everleigh. Miss Marple nodded. She claimed Mr. Pritchard was merely preoccupied when she left. But if she was the last to see him alive, her statement is of the utmost importance. And I must say, She's been remarkably careful in what she chooses to say. Craddock exhaled sharply. I should have pressed her harder. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Well, my dear Inspector, we shall do so now. As they left Denning in his cell, Craddock felt the weight of his earlier assumption bearing down on him. It had seemed so clear, Mortimer's cufflink, Denning's nervousness. But in his eagerness to find a culprit, he had overlooked the subtler details. Someone had planned this well, leaving a false trail in their wake. And that someone was still out there, waiting, watching, perhaps even preparing to strike again. Miss Marple sat quietly in the inspector's office, her hands folded neatly on her lap, while Craddock paced in short, restless strides. The weight of their earlier miscalculation still hung in the air. They had been so close, so very close, to believing the case solved. And yet the true culprit remained in the shadows. We must go back, she said softly. Back before Mr. Pritchard's death, before the cufflink, before the letter. We have been looking at this as a crime of the moment, but I do believe it has deeper roots. Craddock stopped pacing and frowned. You mean a connection from the past? Miss Marple nodded. A thread that was pulled long before Mr. Pritchard breathed his last. Craddock sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Well, let's look at what we know. Pritchard was a banker, an old-fashioned one by all accounts. He didn't believe in sentiment when it came to money. He denied Mortimer a loan. He refused Denning an extension. He held firm against Miss Everleigh's attempts to persuade him otherwise. But bankers do not merely deal with loans, Inspector. They deal with secrets. And I wonder, was there a secret buried in his records? Something that someone did not wish to be found? Craddock's brow furrowed. We went through his files. They were in order, nothing out of place except for that letter he left unsent. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Ah, but perhaps it was not the letter itself that was important, but what he meant to say. Craddock hesitated. Then, with a nod, he grabbed his coat. Right, we're going back to the bank. They arrived to find Ronald Nash still at his desk, his usual air of composure slightly frayed. He looked up as they entered, setting aside a stack of ledgers. Inspector, Miss Marple, we need access to Mr. Pritchard's private records again, Craddock said without preamble. Particularly any dealings with long-standing clients. Nash blinked. Of course, but I already showed you everything. Miss Marple gave him a kindly smile. I do not mean the ordinary records, Mr. Nash. I mean the matters that Mr. Pritchard may have handled personally. Nash hesitated, then slowly stood and led them to the bank manager's office. The room still held the air of its former occupant, orderly, restrained, yet carrying the faintest presence of something unresolved. There is a separate file cabinet, Nash admitted. Mr. Pritchard kept older records here. He had a habit of keeping things just in case. Craddock stepped forward. Let's see them. The drawers groaned slightly as Nash pulled them open. The scent of aged paper and ink rose to meet them. He flipped through files methodically, the rustling pages the only sound in the quiet office. Then he paused. This might be something. He extracted a yellowed file and set it on the desk. Craddock leaned in, eyes narrowing as he scanned the name printed on the cover. Mortimer. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her fingers tapped lightly on the arm of her chair. Let's see what Mr. Pritchard was holding on to, Craddock muttered. The file contained an old loan agreement, one made nearly 20 years ago. The signature at the bottom was Charles Mortimer's, Gerald's father. The sum had been substantial, but beneath the original agreement, clipped to the inside of the folder, was something else. A second document, dated some 10 years later. A settlement agreement. Mortimer's father borrowed a great deal, Nash murmured, but it seems the loan was settled under unusual circumstances. Craddock scanned the page. There's no record of full repayment. It just says, settled in full by private arrangement. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Oh, now that is interesting. Someone paid the debt, but not in the usual way. Craddock turned to Nash. Do you know who covered it? Nash shook his head. I've never seen this file before. Miss Marple, however, was deep in thought. We must ask Mr. Mortimer himself. They wasted no time returning to Mortimer's crumbling estate. This time, when Gerald Mortimer opened the door, his expression darkened at the sight of them. What now, Inspector? Craddock held up the file. We found this in Pritchard's records. Mortimer's face remained impassive, but something flickered behind his eyes. It's about your father, Miss Marple said gently. About his debts. Someone settled them, didn't they? For a moment, Mortimer said nothing. Then, finally, he exhaled and stepped aside. Come in. The house bore the weight of its history. Faded portraits, threadbare rugs, a grandeur that had long since slipped through the cracks. Mortimer sank into an armchair, his fingers steepled. You want to know who paid my father's debts? Miss Marple nodded. Mortimer's jaw tightened. It was Everly. Craddock straightened. Everly? Yes, not Miss Everly. Her father. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but Craddock exhaled sharply. James Everly. He paid off Mortimer's father's debts. Mortimer nodded. In exchange for something. I never knew what. But it was no act of charity. My father was a proud man. He wouldn't have taken money unless he had no other choice. Craddock's mind raced. And now Pritchard digs up the file. He starts writing a letter, and suddenly he ends up dead. Miss Marple smiled faintly. You see, Inspector, the past does cast a long shadow. The question is, what was James Everly's hold over the Mortimers, and why was it dangerous enough to kill for? The answer, they both knew, lay with Miss Everly, and this time she would have no choice but to tell the truth. Miss Marple sat with perfect composure in the drawing-room of Everly Manor, hands neatly folded in her lap, eyes scanning the delicate floral wallpaper as if it held some great secret. Across from her, Diana Everly perched stiffly in her chair, her fingers tapping soundlessly against the armrest. Inspector Craddock stood by the window, his gaze steady, watching for the slightest shift in her demeanor. We spoke to Gerald Mortimer, Craddock said, his voice even. He told us something rather interesting about your father. Diana's chin lifted. My father was a generous man. Miss Marple smiled, the kind, patient smile of an old woman who had seen much and forgotten nothing. Generosity is such a lovely quality, she agreed. And yet, dear, true generosity does not always come with conditions, does it? Diana's hand stilled. What are you implying? Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. That your father did not settle Charles Mortimer's debts simply out of kindness, and that perhaps, whatever arrangement they had, it did not end when Mr. Mortimer passed away. Diana hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. That was enough. Craddock pressed forward. Pritchard found something in the bank records. Something about that old agreement troubled him enough to write a letter he never sent. We need to know why. Diana's fingers curled against the fabric of her dress. I wouldn't know, she said coolly. That was years ago. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Perhaps, but isn't it fascinating, my dear, how the past has a way of catching up with us? She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering just so. You see, what puzzles me is this. Your father had no reason to take an interest in Mortimer's affairs, unless, of course, there was something valuable at stake. Diana's expression remained smooth, but her breath caught, only slightly. But Miss Marple noticed. I fail to see how this concerns me. Oh, but it does, dear, Miss Marple said, because someone wanted to ensure that whatever Mr. Pritchard uncovered never saw the light of day. Diana's gaze flickered, just for a heartbeat, toward the mantelpiece where an old photograph stood. Miss Marple followed her glance, taking in the image of a young James Everley shaking hands with Charles Mortimer outside what appeared to be an old estate. A small brass plaque on the bottom read, "Wintermere House, 1910. Miss Marple's lips pursed in thought. Wintermere House. How very interesting. Diana's shoulders stiffened. It's nothing. Just an old family property. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet Mr. Pritchard must have found something about it rather important. Craddock stepped in. We'll be looking into Wintermere House, Miss Everley. If there's anything you'd like to share before we do, now would be the time. Diana stood abruptly. I have nothing more to say. Miss Marple smiled again, unruffled. Then we shall let the past speak for itself. The journey to Wintermere House was a short one, but the house itself had the air of forgotten things. The gardens had grown wild, ivy creeping over the once grand facade. Craddock pushed open the heavy oak door, the scent of damp wood and dust curling into the air. Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes sweeping the room, her mind working. This place had once been important. It had once held secrets, and somewhere within its walls, those secrets remained. Let's split up, Craddock said. There must be something here that ties it all together. Miss Marple moved through the parlor, her steps measured. The furnishings were covered in white sheets, the fireplace cold and unused, but it was not the room itself that interested her. It was the silence, a silence so perfect it felt unnatural. Then she saw it, a small, almost imperceptible mark on the wooden floor near the hearth, a scuff where something heavy had once been dragged. She knelt carefully, running her fingers along the grooves in the wood. A large piece of furniture had stood here once. A cabinet, perhaps. A desk. She turned to Craddock. Inspector, I do believe something was removed from this house, and not very long ago. Craddock crouched beside her, studying the marks. You think Pritchard found something here? Something that got him killed? Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. Perhaps. Or perhaps he knew what used to be here and was trying to retrieve it. She glanced at Diana Everley, who had reluctantly followed them inside, standing stiffly by the door. Her face was pale, her fingers clenched around the strap of her handbag. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. You know what was here, don't you, my dear? Diana swallowed. I don't. Miss Marple held up a hand, her voice calm. Lying is terribly exhausting, my dear, and quite unnecessary. You see, it is not the house itself that matters. It is what was taken from it. Diana remained silent, but her fingers trembled. Miss Marple pressed gently. Let us suppose for a moment that your father and Charles Mortimer had a business arrangement beyond mere loans. Suppose something valuable was hidden here. A document, perhaps. A deed. Or something more dangerous. Craddock frowned. A ledger, maybe. Something that could prove fraud? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Perhaps something that could ruin a family name. Diana's breath came sharp. You have no proof. Miss Marple's voice remained serene. Then why are you so afraid, dear? Diana's mask cracked. Just slightly, just enough. Craddock stepped forward. You were here the night Pritchard died, weren't you? Did he find something? Did you take it from him? Diana's lips parted, but she said nothing. Miss Marple sighed softly. Truth has a way of surfacing, my dear. It is far less painful to speak it willingly. Diana's shoulders sagged, and then finally she whispered, It wasn't supposed to go this far. Craddock's jaw clenched. What did you do? Diana hesitated, then reached into her handbag. She pulled out an old creased document, her hands shaking. It's the original agreement, she murmured. Between my father and Charles Mortimer. They weren't just business partners. They were covering something up. Miss Marple took the document delicately. And Mr. Pritchard found out. Diana nodded, her voice hoarse. He came to me that night. He said he was going to the authorities. I couldn't let him." Craddock's eyes darkened. "So you killed him?" Diana's face twisted. "No, I confronted him, yes, but he was alive when I left. I swear it." Miss Marple studied her carefully. There was fear in her eyes. Guilt, but not the guilt of a murderer. She turned to Craddock. "I do believe, Inspector, that the true killer is still waiting in the shadows." Craddock exhaled sharply. "Then we need to flush them out, and I think Miss Everly may be the perfect bait." Diana paled. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's smile was kind, but knowing. "The person who killed Mr. Pritchard wanted this document buried. If they believe you still have it, well, my dear, they'll come looking for it." And when they did, Miss Marple would be waiting. Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock returned to Everly Manor under the heavy shroud of a gathering storm. The weight of Diana Everly's confession had provided clarity, but not finality. She had confronted Mr. Pritchard, yes, but she had not killed him, which meant the true murderer was still out there, watching, waiting. Diana sat stiffly in the drawing room, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea. Miss Marple had suggested tea, of course. Tea, in her experience, had a way of soothing nerves and loosening tongues. But Diana remained withdrawn, her gaze flitting toward the document that now rested on the table between them. The agreement that had tied her father and Charles Mortimer together in something more than simple business. Craddock paced near the fireplace, uneasy. "Who else knew about this document?" he asked. Diana hesitated. "No one. Not until Mr. Pritchard found it. But when he did, I think he told someone. That's why he wrote the letter." Miss Marple tapped a delicate finger against the armrest of her chair. "And yet, he never sent it. That suggests he was stopped before he could." Craddock exhaled sharply. "And someone's still trying to stop us." He nodded toward the document. "We need to secure this." "I should say so," Miss Marple agreed. "It would be most inconvenient if it were to disappear." And yet, deep in her bones, she already knew it would. They placed the document in a locked drawer in Craddock's office at the village police station. It seemed the safest option, under the watchful eye of law enforcement, behind a stout oak door, away from prying hands. But safety, as Miss Marple well knew, was often an illusion. The next morning, Craddock called Miss Marple with a voice like crushed gravel. "It's gone." She had expected it. Oh dear. The lock was forced, but cleanly, no sign of brute force. Someone knew exactly what they were after. Miss Marple nodded, unseen. Of course, it was too important not to be taken. Craddock's frustration crackled down the line. "We had it for less than a day. Someone's working against us." Miss Marple reached for her hat. "Then we must work faster, dear." The scene at the police station was a picture of controlled frustration. The drawer had been pried open with remarkable precision. No reckless rummaging, no signs of a desperate search. Whoever had done it had known exactly where to look. Craddock ran a hand through his hair. "No forced entry. The constable on duty swears no one suspicious came or went. Either it was an inside job, or someone's very good at what they do." Miss Marple peered at the drawer, eyes bright with thought. "The real question is, why take it now?" Craddock folded his arms. "To destroy it, obviously." Miss Marple's gaze remained thoughtful. "Perhaps. But if the goal were only to destroy it, they could have done so long ago." "No, I rather think they needed to see it first." Craddock frowned. "You think someone needed to read what was in it?" Miss Marple nodded. "And then, once they had what they needed, they made sure we no longer did." Craddock's expression darkened. "Then we're missing a key piece of the puzzle." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, but dear, sometimes the absence of a thing tells us just as much as its presence." Craddock sighed, rubbing at his temple. That's very poetic, Miss Marple, but it doesn't help me catch a thief. She patted his arm kindly. Poetry aside, dear, I do believe it helps us narrow our suspects. After all, who needed to see that document the most? Craddock exhaled, his mind already sorting through the tangled threads of the case. Diana had already read it. We had read it. That leaves... Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Someone who knew of its existence but had not yet laid eyes upon it. Craddock straightened. Someone who wasn't sure exactly what it contained. Miss Marple nodded. And who, upon seeing it, realized they had something to lose. Craddock's jaw tightened. Then that means... A sharp knock interrupted them. A constable peered in, looking wary. "Inspector, you've got a visitor. Gerald Mortimer." Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged glances. Gerald Mortimer, son of the late Charles Mortimer, a man with no apparent reason to care about an old business agreement, unless, of course, he had every reason to care. Gerald Mortimer sat across from them, his face composed but his hands restless, fingers tracing invisible patterns on his knee. His suit was crisp, his hair neatly combed, but there was an air of something unsettled about him. "I heard about the break-in," he said. "Quite the scandal." Craddock studied him. "Interesting, Mr. Mortimer, that you would come here just as we were discussing missing evidence." Mortimer smiled faintly. "I do try to keep informed." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Oh dear, I imagine you do. Particularly when it concerns matters that might, shall we say, affect your family's legacy." His fingers stilled. "I'm not sure what you mean." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle. "The document that was taken, Mr. Mortimer. It contained a rather unfortunate truth about your father and Mr. Everley." Mortimer's smile tightened. "Whatever dealings they had were before my time." Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering. "Oh, but dear, the consequences of the past have a way of finding their way into the present. You knew about the document, didn't you? You had to see it, to know what it contained." Mortimer's jaw shifted, but he did not deny it. Craddock leaned forward. "And once you had, you made sure no one else could." Mortimer exhaled through his nose. "I don't know what you're implying, Inspector." Miss Marple's voice was light, but sharp. "Simply that you had much to lose. More than Diana, more than anyone else. Because if that agreement became public, it wouldn't just ruin the Everleys. It would ruin the Mortimers too." Mortimer's silence was telling. Craddock's voice was steady. "Where is it, Mortimer?" A long pause. Then quietly, "Gone." Craddock cursed under his breath. "Burned." A slow nod. Miss Marple's face betrayed no surprise. "Ah, quite thorough." Mortimer straightened. "Now you have no proof." "No proof of anything." Craddock scowled. "Destroying evidence doesn't mean destroying guilt." Mortimer met his gaze. "But it does mean you have nothing to charge me with." Miss Marple's lips curved. "Oh, my dear boy, guilt has a way of revealing itself in time." Mortimer's composure wavered just for a moment. Then he rose. "If there's nothing further, Inspector." Craddock's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "For now." Mortimer turned and strode out, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. Craddock let out a slow breath. "Damn." Miss Marple merely sipped her tea. "Oh, Inspector, the game isn't over yet." Craddock shot her a look. "We just lost our best evidence." Miss Marple smiled, eyes bright with something knowing. "Perhaps, dear. But when someone is desperate enough, a chill had settled over St. Mary Mead, one that had nothing to do with the weather. The theft of the document and its subsequent destruction had left the investigation teetering on the edge of uncertainty, yet Miss Marple remained unshaken. She had seen enough over the years to know that the truth, much like a stubborn weed, had a way of breaking through even the most carefully tended lies. And Gerald Mortimer, well, he had been rather too precise in his actions, hadn't he? A little too eager to erase a piece of the past, it suggested something more than simple business, something worth killing for. Inspector Craddock was not nearly as composed. "It's infuriating," he muttered as they walked through the village toward Everley Manor. "We have the truth right in our hands." Miss Marple tucked her hands into the folds of her cardigan. "Oh dear, but we never truly did. The truth is not in papers or documents, Inspector. It is in people, and people, as you've seen, can be quite careless with their secrets." They had nearly reached the gates of the manor when the sound of running footsteps echoed from the driveway. A young maid, breathless and pale, rushed toward them. "It's Miss Everley," she gasped. "She's gone." Craddock stiffened. "Gone?" The girl nodded frantically. She was in her room after lunch, but when I went to check on her, the door was open and she wasn't there. And her things, her coat, her handbag, they're still inside." Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, his frustration giving way to sharp focus. A disappearance, not an accident, not a choice. No, this was something deliberate. Inside the manor, the air was thick with tension. Diana's bedroom was as the maid had described. Her handbag sat untouched on the dressing table, a coat still draped over the chair. The window, however, was another matter. Miss Marple approached it carefully. The latch had been forced, subtly, but enough to suggest an exit not taken by choice. She ran a finger over the edge of the wooden frame, noting the faintest splintering near the lock. A soft sigh left her lips. "Oh dear." Craddock crouched near the window, his expression dark. "So she didn't run. Someone took her." Miss Marple nodded. "I rather think they wanted us to know, don't you? A missing woman is quite a statement." Craddock stood abruptly. "We need to search the grounds. If she was taken by force, there may be signs of a struggle." The search unfolded quickly. The staff scoured the gardens, the hedgerows, and the narrow pathway leading to the village, but there was no trace of Diana. The frustration mounted with each passing minute until one of the footmen, breathless and pale, called from the orchard. "Inspector, over here!" They rushed forward, hearts pounding, only to find not Diana, but a shoe. A single-heeled slipper abandoned at the edge of the orchard where the ground dipped toward the woods. Miss Marple crouched and lifted it gently. "Hers?" The maid who had raised the alarm earlier nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Craddock exhaled sharply. "Then she came this way." "Or," Miss Marple murmured, "she was brought this way." The orchard gave way to a winding trail leading toward the river that cut through the far edge of the village. The path was well worn, but in the fading light, Craddock spotted what he had been hoping for: disturbed earth, footprints in the damp soil. Two sets, one lighter, dragging slightly, the other heavier, firm. Craddock's expression turned grim. Someone carried her. Miss Marple studied the ground, her face unreadable. Toward the water. A sick dread settled in Craddock's gut. He moved faster, tracing the path, eyes scanning the ground. The river was just beyond the bend, its waters sluggish but deep. The thought of what they might find there sent a cold shiver through him. But then, movement. From the trees ahead, a rustling sound. A figure emerging from the underbrush. Diana Everley. She staggered forward, her dress torn, her hair disheveled, her face pale as death. Craddock caught her as she collapsed, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Miss Everley, are you hurt?" Her breath came in gasps, her fingers digging into his coat as she clung to him. He tried to—" She shook her head violently, unable to finish. "I got away. I ran—" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Who, dear?" Diana's eyes lifted, wild with fear. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, the last of her strength gave way, and she slumped against Craddock. Craddock swore under his breath. "We need to get her inside." Miss Marple nodded, and quickly. "Whoever did this will not be pleased to find her still breathing." Diana had been given tea, warm blankets, and a quiet place in the Everley sitting room, but the terror had not yet left her eyes. It took time. Soft words, gentle coaxing, before she finally spoke. He came through the window. I didn't even hear him at first." Her hands trembled around the teacup. "He told me not to scream, that if I just came quietly, no harm would come to me." Craddock's voice was tight. "Did you see his face?" Diana swallowed. "No, he wore something over it. A scarf, I think." She shuddered. "But his hands were rough, strong." Miss Marple nodded. "And he took you outside?" Diana closed her eyes. "Yes, down the orchard path, toward the river." Her breath hitched. "He was going to—" She stopped, shaking her head violently. "I fought him. I kicked. I scratched. I bit his arm. He cursed and let go just for a moment. That's when I ran." Craddock's jaw clenched. "And you don't know who it was?" Diana hesitated. I don't know." Her voice was small. "But when he spoke, I think I recognized his voice." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "How so, dear?" Diana gripped the teacup tightly as if it might ground her. It was muffled, but familiar. "Someone I've spoken to before." Craddock's fists tightened. "Someone close to the case." Miss Marple sighed, though her voice was kind. "Oh, dear, that does rather suggest the villain has grown desperate, doesn't it?" Craddock met her gaze. "Desperate men make mistakes." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, Inspector, and I do believe he's just made a rather large one." "Oh, to burn the truth. They always leave behind a little smoke." Miss Marple sat quietly in the Everleigh drawing-room, her hands resting lightly on her lap as she listened to the rain tapping against the window. Inspector Craddock paced, his frustration evident in every sharp turn of his step. Across from them, Diana Everleigh sat stiff-backed on the settee, hands clasped tightly as she stared at the floor. Though she had recovered some of her composure, the shadow of fear had not yet left her. She had come face to face with something dark, something cruel, and yet she had survived. That alone, Miss Marple thought, had unsettled her attacker more than anything else. Craddock exhaled sharply. "We need to go over this again. Diana, you said the voice was familiar, but not enough to place?" Diana hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I know I've heard it before. The way he spoke, there was something about his tone, his inflection. It's someone I've spoken to at least a few times, but I can't quite put my finger on it." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And yet, it frightened you?" Diana shuddered. "Yes." There was a beat of silence. Then Miss Marple asked, quite casually, "Tell me, dear, what did he say?" Diana blinked, startled. "What?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Sometimes, dear, it is not only the voice we recognize, but the words themselves." "What exactly did he say to you?" Diana swallowed, then closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember. "He told me to be quiet, that if I didn't fight I wouldn't get hurt. He said he only needed time. Just a little time," he said. She frowned, her brows drawing together. "He sounded desperate, almost pleading." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And nothing else?" Diana hesitated. "No, except—" Her eyes widened slightly. "He called me Diana, dear." Craddock frowned. "That's hardly revealing." Miss Marple, however, did not look so sure. She tapped a finger against her knee thoughtfully. "No, but it is rather familiar, isn't it? A stranger, even an acquaintance, would not use dear so naturally. That suggests a certain closeness." Craddock sighed. "We've been through the list of suspects. Everyone had a motive. Money, self-preservation, revenge. But nothing quite fits the level of desperation we're seeing now. Whoever this is, they're willing to risk everything to silence Diana." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. Which means, Inspector, that the motive we have assumed is likely not the real one." Diana looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. Well, my dear, what if this is not about money at all? Craddock frowned. Then what? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Love, Inspector. Or more precisely, obsession. A heavy silence followed her words. Diana paled slightly. Obsession? Miss Marple folded her hands together. Think of it, dear. A man who calls you Diana, dear. A man who cannot bear the thought of you discovering something. A man who has been watching, waiting, who, when cornered, reacts not with calculated detachment, but with frantic, reckless desperation. She turned to Craddock. Our villain is not some cold schemer, Inspector. He is a man who has lost control. Craddock's frown deepened. But who? Miss Marple's gaze was soft as she turned back to Diana. Tell me, dear, who in your life has always been watching over you? Who has been close enough to know your routines, your vulnerabilities? Who has been a constant presence, but never someone you would suspect? Diana's lips parted slightly. Then realization dawned in her eyes, and her breath caught in her throat. No, she whispered. Not him. Craddock straightened. Who? Diana's voice shook. Mr. Redfern. There was a beat of silence before Craddock swore under his breath. The solicitor? Diana nodded slowly, her fingers digging into her skirts. He was always there? When my father died, he handled everything. He's been managing the estate, the finances. He's always been around. She swallowed. And he was the one who warned me about Uncle Gerald. He told me I shouldn't trust him. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And yet, my dear, it was not your uncle who tried to kill you, was it? Diana's breath hitched. But why? Craddock's expression was grim. That's what we're going to find out. Redfern had been caught off guard when Craddock and his men arrived at his home. He had greeted them with his usual composed demeanor, but Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his posture. The moment Diana's name was mentioned, his eyes flickered, just for a second, but enough. I don't know what you're suggesting, Inspector, he said smoothly, but I have no idea what happened to Miss Everleigh. Miss Marple tilted her head. Oh, but you do, don't you? Her voice was light, almost kind. You see, Mr. Redfern, the truth is, this was never about money. Not really. It was about her. Redfern's fingers twitched. That's absurd. Miss Marple continued as if she hadn't heard him. You have watched over Diana for years. Perhaps at first it was duty, a promise to her father. But over time, that changed, didn't it? You convinced yourself you were the only one who truly cared for her, the only one who could protect her. Redfern's face had gone pale. This is ridiculous, Miss Marple sighed. It must have been quite a shock when Diana began questioning things. She was slipping away from you, wasn't she? And you couldn't bear that. You told yourself you were keeping her safe from Gerald, from the scandal, from the truth. She smiled gently. But in the end, Mr. Redfern, you were only keeping her safe from one thing, the possibility of a life without you in it. For the first time, Redfern's composure cracked. His lips parted, his breath came quicker, and for a moment he looked almost lost. Craddock stepped forward. You tried to kill her. Redfern flinched, his hands clenching. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. You lost control, didn't you? Something dark flickered in his eyes. His breath hitched, and then, finally, he broke. I only wanted... His voice wavered. She wasn't supposed to... He exhaled sharply, then shut his eyes. I loved her. Craddock's jaw tightened. You tried to kill her. Redfern's silence was answer enough. Miss Marple sighed softly. Oh dear. Redfern's breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of his actions settled upon him. Miss Marple observed him carefully. Her keen blue eyes filled with something almost like pity. But there was no softness in Inspector Craddock's expression. He loomed over the man like a judge preparing to pass a sentence, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. "You loved her." Craddock's voice was low, edged with disgust. "Is that what you call it?" Redfern's mouth opened, but whatever words he might have spoken caught in his throat. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Love, Mr. Redfern, is a very curious thing. It can bring out the best in a person, or the very worst. And I dare say you, dear sir, have confused love with possession." Redfern's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Shame, fury, grief. "You don't understand," he whispered. She was slipping away. Everything was changing. She started asking questions, doubting me. He stopped himself, jaw clenching. "I only wanted to protect her." Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "No, Mr. Redfern, you wanted to control her." Craddock stepped forward. "Where's the evidence, Redfern? You've already lost. You may as well tell us where it is." For a long moment, Redfern was silent. Then, something in his expression shifted. The resignation Miss Marple had hoped for did not come. Instead, his lips pressed into a thin line and a strange light entered his eyes. A flicker of something reckless, something dangerous. And then, suddenly, he moved. It happened so quickly that even Craddock, for all his training, barely had time to react. Redfern lunged for the fireplace, snatching up the iron poker with a speed that belied his usually measured demeanor. The room seemed to tighten with tension, the air thick with the unspoken understanding that he had nothing left to lose. Diana let out a startled gasp and shrank back against the settee. Craddock reached for his revolver, but Miss Marple did something quite unexpected. She stood. It was a simple, unhurried movement, utterly devoid of fear. The effect was immediate. Redfern faltered, his grip tightening on the poker, but something about the way Miss Marple regarded him, calm, expectant, held him frozen in place. "My dear Mr. Redfern," she said, her voice soft but steady, "surely you must see that this will accomplish nothing." Redfern's chest rose and fell in sharp bursts. I won't let you take everything from me." Miss Marple tilted her head. "We aren't taking anything from you, dear. You've already lost it." The words landed like a blow. Redfern blinked rapidly, his breath hitching. His knuckles whitened around the poker, his body trembling with the effort of holding himself together. Miss Marple took a single step forward. "You see, Mr. Redfern, love, true love, does not require secrecy, nor fear, nor violence. It does not demand obedience or erase another's will." She let the words settle before continuing. "You say you love Diana, and perhaps, in your own way, you believe that to be true. But love does not kill, and it most certainly does not terrify." Redfern's entire frame sagged. His fingers twitched around the poker, and for a moment it seemed as though he might yet strike, might yet lash out in one final, desperate attempt to regain control. But then, quite suddenly, the fight left him. His grip loosened, and the poker clattered to the floor with a dull thud. Craddock wasted no time. In an instant, he was upon Redfern, forcing his arms behind his back and snapping the handcuffs into place. The defeated solicitor did not resist. He only stood there, shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor as though seeing, for the first time, the depth of the abyss he had fallen into. Diana let out a shuddering breath. Miss Marple watched Redfern for a long moment before finally speaking. "It is a terrible thing to convince oneself that an act of cruelty is an act of love." Craddock, still holding Redfern in his grasp, nodded grimly. A terrible thing indeed. And with that, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. As Inspector Craddock led Redfern away, the room was steeped in an eerie quiet. The sense of finality hung in the air, yet Miss Marple did not move to sit down, nor did she allow relief to settle. Her hands remained gently clasped, and her gaze followed Redfern with a peculiar intensity. Diana exhaled, a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief washing over her. "It's over," she murmured. almost as though she needed to say it aloud to believe it. But Miss Marple did not echo the sentiment. She pursed her lips, her eyes flicking toward the fireplace where Redfern had lunged for the poker. The metal tool now lay on the floor, a discarded weapon of desperation, and yet something about it gnawed at her. Then she saw it, a small, nearly imperceptible detail, so easy to miss in the heightened tension of the moment. The poker, in Redfern's grasp, had not been used to strike. He had grabbed it instinctively, as any cornered man might. But what had caught Miss Marple's attention was the slight smudge on the metal shaft. Not soot, as one might expect from a fireplace. Implement, but something different. Something faintly red. Blood. Her breath caught for the briefest of moments. That was odd. The murder had been committed with poison, not blunt force. Why, then, was there blood on the poker? Her gaze lifted toward the fireplace. The polished wood mantel gleamed in the dim light, but there, just barely visible, was a small, dark stain. It had been wiped hurriedly, yet traces remained. A second crime? A struggle no one had accounted for? Miss Marple turned sharply toward Diana. "My dear," she said gently, but with unmistakable intent, "where were you when Mr. Redfern attempted to flee?" Diana, who had been steadying herself with a hand against the armrest, hesitated just slightly before answering. "Why, I was—" She stopped. A flicker of something crossed her face. "I don't remember. It was all such a blur." But Miss Marple did not look away. "You didn't think to run?" Diana's fingers curled slightly against the fabric of her skirt. I was in shock." "Yes, of course," Miss Marple said soothingly, her voice as soft as ever, "and yet, shock does not wipe away blood, does it?" Diana's breath hitched. A single second passed, but the weight of it felt immense. "I beg your pardon," Miss Marple gestured toward the fireplace. "There's something curious, dear. Blood on the poker, but no wound accounted for, and the mantel, someone tried to clean it." Diana's face remained carefully composed, but her fingers twitched. A small, almost imperceptible movement. Miss Marple pressed on. "You were so very eager to have Redfern accused, weren't you? And I do believe he was guilty. Oh, yes, indeed. But I wonder, was he the only guilty party?" Diana let out a brittle laugh. "Miss Marple, this is absurd. I was a victim in all of this." "Oh, I am certain you were," Miss Marple agreed, nodding. "But victims, too, can have secrets, can't they? What was it that happened here, Diana, before we arrived? What was it that made you wipe away blood? What truth did you not want us to see?" Diana's entire posture shifted, stiffening, then loosening all at once. The fight in her seemed to drain away, but in its place came something else, a kind of weary inevitability. "You're clever," she whispered. Miss Marple simply waited. Diana exhaled sharply, as though she had finally accepted something she had been holding back for too long. "Redfern, he didn't act alone." The words settled over the room like a fine mist of cold air. Craddock, who had returned just in time to hear it, stopped short in the doorway. "What are you saying?" Diana's lips pressed into a thin line. "He was desperate. He had to act fast after he realized I'd figured it out. But he wasn't the one who put the poison in the drink." A beat of silence. Then Miss Marple's voice came, ever gentle. "Then who did?" Diana lifted her chin. Her eyes, filled with something between defiance and regret, met Miss Marple's. "I did." Even Craddock, hardened by years of police work, looked momentarily stunned. "You?" Diana nodded once. "Redfern was manipulative, controlling. He played his games, thinking he always had the upper hand. But he underestimated me. When I realized he had planned to kill Harold, I knew I had to act first." Her hands clenched into fists. "So I did." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "But something went wrong." Diana swallowed hard. "Yes, Harold was never supposed to drink it. That was meant for Redfern. A grim hush fell over the room. Craddock exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You poisoned a man, Diana." Diana's expression twisted. "I was trying to save myself." Miss Marple sighed, though there was no judgment in her voice, only a quiet sorrow. "And yet, my dear, in trying to escape one monster, you became another." Diana's breath shuddered as she looked away, and in that moment it was clear. Redfern had been guilty of many things: manipulation, deceit, cruelty. But he had not been the one to place the fatal dose in the banker's drink. Diana had tried to turn the tables on him, but fate had played its own cruel trick. Inspector Craddock, steeling himself, reached for his handcuffs once more. "Diana Holland, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Harold Whitmore." Diana did not resist. She only let out a soft, brittle laugh, half regret, half disbelief. "I suppose," she murmured, "I always knew it would end this way." And as Craddock led her away, Miss Marple finally sat down, her hands folding neatly in her lap. She had always known that love could drive people to terrible things, but tonight she had seen just how far some were willing to go, to escape, to survive, to win. And in the end, no one had won at all. As Diana Holland was led away in silence, the weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. The room, once filled with whispers and suspicion, now felt eerily empty. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands gently folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the flickering embers in the fireplace. The case had reached its conclusion, at least in the eyes of the law, but something still troubled her. Craddock, standing near the doorway, let out a breath. "It's done," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Redfern and Diana, both guilty in their own ways. Strange, isn't it? One trying to kill the other, and in the end, it was their own tangled web that undid them. Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Quite so, Inspector. Though I wonder, does it not strike you as odd?" Craddock frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of her chair. "The poison, my dear. Diana admitted to placing it in the drink, believing she was targeting Redfern. But there is something I cannot quite put out of my mind." She paused, as if weighing her words. How was she so certain he would drink from that glass? Craddock blinked. Well, she must have known his habits. Perhaps he always took that particular drink, or... Miss Marple sighed. Yes, that is possible. But what if there was another hand at play? Someone who ensured that Harold, not Redfern, was the one to drink it? The inspector's face darkened. "You're suggesting there was a third party involved?" Miss Marple rose, moving slowly toward the fireplace. She traced a delicate hand along the edge of the mantel where the faint stain of blood still lingered. "The evidence has all been pointing toward Redfern and Diana. And yet, what if that was precisely the intention?" She turned, her sharp blue eyes meeting Craddock's. What if the true villain never intended to be caught at all? Craddock stiffened. "Who are you thinking of?" Miss Marple hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "There was someone else in that house that evening, Inspector. Someone who had motive enough to see Harold dead but was careful never to draw attention to themselves." Craddock's brow furrowed as he considered the possibility. "Are you saying—" A soft creak interrupted them. Both turned swiftly. Standing just outside the doorway, half shrouded in shadow, was Evelyn Whitmore. The widow's face was pale, her expression unreadable. Yet in her eyes there was something, a flicker of something too well hidden, too carefully controlled. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. "My dear Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly, "you have been very quiet through all of this." Evelyn stepped forward slowly, folding her hands in front of her. "I had nothing to say." Craddock's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing. And yet you were listening just now, weren't you? Evelyn tilted her head slightly, offering a faint, unreadable smile. Wouldn't anyone? After all, it's been such a fascinating unraveling of events. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Yes, quite fascinating. A silence stretched between them before Miss Marple continued. Diana believed she was killing Redfern, and yet the drink ended up in Harold's hands. It would be so simple, wouldn't it, to ensure that exchange? A whisper here, a subtle redirection there. Harold trusted you, I imagine. Evelyn's lips parted slightly. That's a terrible accusation, Miss Marple. Miss Marple did not waver. Is it? Craddock stepped forward now, his voice harder. If you knew that drink was poisoned, Mrs. Whitmore, and you allowed your husband to take it— Evelyn let out a soft, almost wistful laugh. Oh, Inspector, she murmured. You make it sound so deliberate. Miss Marple tilted her head. Wasn't it? Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she exhaled, her fingers loosening. Harold was not a kind man, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. He was cruel, controlling. Diana thought she was saving herself, but she was not the only one who needed saving. She glanced toward the fireplace. Perhaps I did nudge fate a little. Just enough. Craddock's jaw tightened. That's murder, Mrs. Whitmore. Evelyn's eyes met his. Then charge me. Miss Marple studied her carefully, and something passed between them, an understanding, quiet but firm. You were terribly clever, my dear, she said softly, and terribly lucky. Evelyn's smile was thin. Luck had nothing to do with it, Miss Marple. Only patience. There was no remorse in her voice. No fear. Craddock took a slow breath, then turned to Miss Marple. Do we have enough to charge her? Miss Marple hesitated, then shook her head. No proof, only the truth, which is quite a different thing. Evelyn's smile deepened. Then I suppose justice has been served after all, hasn't it? Miss Marple did not reply. As Evelyn turned and walked away, her footsteps unhurried, Craddock let out a quiet curse. She's going to get away with it. Miss Marple watched the widow disappear down the hall, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Inspector. A pause. For now. As Miss Marple stepped outside, the crisp evening air carried the scent of rain, mingling with the fading traces of cigar smoke from the constables still stationed near the manor's entrance. The night was quiet now, save for the distant murmur of voices and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Craddock fell into step beside her, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, his brow furrowed in frustration. I don't like it, he muttered. Evelyn Whitmore walks free, and we both know she had a hand in it. Miss Marple clasped her gloved hands together, her expression unreadable. Knowing and proving, my dear Inspector, are two very different things. Craddock shook his head. It doesn't sit right with me. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. Nor with me. They walked in silence for a few moments before he spoke again, quieter this time. You think she'll do it again? Miss Marple sighed. No, not quite. Evelyn Whitmore is not a woman of impulse. She waited years to see Harold out of her way, and she will wait again if necessary. Craddock's mouth tightened. So that's it? We leave it at that? Miss Marple stopped walking, turning to face him. For now, Inspector. Some mysteries are not solved with a single revelation, nor do they always end with handcuffs. Her eyes twinkled faintly. But they do have a way of unraveling when left in the hands of time. Craddock exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That's not very reassuring. Miss Marple's expression softened. Patience, dear boy. They reached Craddock's car, and he hesitated, glancing back at the manor, its dark silhouette looming against the sky, its secrets nestled within its walls. He turned, back to Miss Marple, studying her. You're not done thinking about this, are you? She smiled, ever so slightly. A detective's work is never truly done, Inspector. Craddock scoffed, amused despite himself. I'll take your word for it. He opened the car door, then paused. You'll let me know if anything comes up? Miss Marple inclined her head. Of course. With a final nod, he slid into the car and drove off, the tail lights vanishing into the distance. Miss Marple remained where she was, watching until the night swallowed the last trace of him. Then, with a quiet breath, she turned back toward the manor. Something still wasn't right. Not Evelyn Whitmore. No, she had played her role well, and perhaps she would go on living her life without ever needing to scheme again. But something else remained, a thread unpulled, a detail that nagged at her in the way that only an incomplete puzzle could. Miss Marple retraced her steps slowly, her mind sifting through the evening's events. The confession, the poison, the well-laid plans, the misplaced suspicions. And then, a moment. A small, insignificant moment. Harold Whitmore had hesitated before drinking. She could see it now as clear as if she were back in that very room. He had hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Not out of fear, not out of uncertainty, but out of knowledge. As though he had realized, too late, that something was wrong. But how could he have known? Miss Marple stopped in her tracks, her pulse quickening. Unless, of course, someone had warned him. Her breath caught slightly, and a slow, dawning realization settled over her. Evelyn had orchestrated much, that was certain, but she had not been alone. There was another hand at play, someone who had seen the threads of deception being woven and had, at the very last moment, tried to tug one loose. And perhaps, if she was careful, if she was patient, she could find out who. Because as much as this mystery seemed solved, one thing was certain. It was not quite over yet.